A split-second assumption can destroy a lifetime of work. When an arrogant patrolman decided to brutally harass a black man in a wealthy neighborhood, he thought he was bagging a common criminal. He had no idea the man in handcuffs was his ultimate boss, and the impending karma would be absolute. The morning air in the affluent neighborhood of Oak Ridge Heights was crisp, smelling faintly of manicured pine and expensive landscaping. It was the kind of gated-adjacent community where the lawns were cut with geometric precision and luxury sedans sat quietly in pristine driveways. For Julian Voss, a 58-year-old man with salt and pepper hair, a broad athletic build, and a mind sharpened by 30 years of legal and tactical experience, it was simply home. Julian was not just a successful man. He was a titan in his field. After decades working his way up through the Department of Justice, dismantling organized crime syndicates, and prosecuting deeply rooted institutional corruption, he had recently accepted the most powerful position in the city's law enforcement apparatus. How was the newly appointed police commissioner, the ultimate authority over a department of 10,000 sworn officers. He had been brought in quietly by the mayor, specifically to clean house. The department was plagued by civil rights lawsuits, unchecked egos, and a toxic culture of zero accountability. Julian had spent his first 2 weeks behind closed doors, reviewing internal affairs files, memorizing names, and preparing to drop the hammer. On this particular morning, Julian was entirely off the clock, dressed in a faded gray college hoodie, black jogging sweatpants, and worn-out running shoes. He had just finished a grueling 5-mile run. He stood at the end of his own winding cobblestone driveway, holding a ring of keys, inspecting a malfunctioning hinge on his sprawling wrought-iron mailbox. I was breathing heavily, his mind focused on the mundane task of fixing the metal door, completely unaware that he was about to experience the exact departmental rot he had been hired to eradicate. 2 blocks away, a standard-issue Crown Victoria police cruiser was rolling through the neighborhood. Behind the wheel sat Officer Brooks Teller, a 15-year veteran of the force. Teller was the archetype of the department's underlying disease. He had a thick neck, a perpetual sneer, and a disciplinary file thick enough to double as a phone book. Over the years, Teller had racked up 7 excessive force complaints, mostly from minority neighborhoods, but thanks to a powerful police union and complacent captains, he had never faced more than a slap on the wrist. Beside him sat Officer Tyler Boone, a 22-year-old rookie, barely 3 months out of the academy. Boone was nervous, eager to please, and entirely too intimidated by his senior partner to ever question his methods. "Look at this," Teller muttered, his eyes locking onto the figure at the end of the driveway. He slowed the cruiser to a crawl. "What do we have here?" Boone leaned forward, squinting through the morning glare. "Looks like a guy checking his mail, Brooks. Probably lives there." Teller scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound that rattled in his throat. "And clothes dressed like a vagrant? Get real, kid. That's a prowler. Probably casing the joint, checking the mailboxes to see if the owners are out of town. I know his type. They hop off the commuter train, walk into the nice zip codes, and take what they want." "I don't know, man." Boone hesitated. "He looks pretty relaxed." "That's how they operate," Teller snapped, hitting the flashing red and blues but leaving the siren off. "Watch and learn, rookie." This is how you do proactive policing. The cruiser accelerated, the tires screeching slightly as Teller aggressively angled the vehicle onto the curb, blocking the driveway and cutting off any path to the street. The blinding strobe of the police lights washed over Julian's face. Julian didn't flinch. He slowly turned away from the mailbox, his expression neutral, his posture relaxed but observant. His eyes immediately darted to the vehicle number on the side of the cruiser, filing it away in his eidetic memory, then moved to the officers stepping out of the car. "Hey, hands where I can see them, right now," Teller barked, his hand already resting heavily on the butt of his service weapon. He slammed the cruiser door shut, marching forward with his chest puffed out, radiating an aggressive, unearned authority. Julian calmly raised his hands to chest level, the keys dangling from his right index finger. He didn't raise them high in surrender. He held them in a measured, calm, de-escalation posture. "Is there a problem, officer?" Julian's voice was deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of fear. It was a voice used to commanding rooms of federal judges, not a voice accustomed to cowering on a sidewalk. "I ask the questions, buddy," Teller snapped, closing the distance until he was mere inches from Julian's face. The officer smelled of stale coffee and cheap cologne. "What are you doing here? You lost?" "I'm not lost," Julian replied evenly, his eyes locking onto Teller's name tag, Teller, B. He knew that name. He had read Teller's internal affairs file recently. The man was a walking liability. "I'm checking my mailbox." "Your mailbox?" Teller laughed loudly, glancing back at Boone, who was standing awkwardly by the passenger door. "You hear this guy, Tyler? He thinks he owns the Montgomery estate. Listen to me, pal. I know the people who live in this neighborhood. You don't fit the profile." "The profile?" Julian arched an eyebrow, his tone shifting from casual to surgically precise. "Are you referring to a criminal profile, Officer Teller, or a demographic one? Because under Terry v. Ohio, you are required to have reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime has been, is being, or is about to be committed to detain me. Looking at a mailbox while wearing a hoodie does not meet that threshold." Teller froze. The absolute last thing an aggressive, corrupt cop wants to hear on the street is a citizen calmly quoting Supreme Court case law. It felt like a direct challenge to his ego, a slap in the face to the badge he wore like a crown. His face flushed a deep, ugly red. "Oh, we got a street lawyer here," Teller sneered, his voice dropping an octave, heavy with menace. "You think you're smart? You think throwing out some legal mumbo-jumbo is going to make me back down? Let me see your ID. Now." "I don't have my wallet on me," Julian said truthfully. "I just went for a run." "It's inside the house." He gestured toward the massive front doors of the estate with his head. "Convenient," Teller spat. "You're trespassing, you're loitering, and now you're refusing a lawful order to identify yourself." "I am not refusing," Julian corrected, his voice remaining terrifyingly calm. "I am physically unable to produce a card. Furthermore, under the state's stop and identify statutes, I am not legally required to provide identification unless I am lawfully arrested, which I am not. I am standing on my own property. You don't have any property here." Teller suddenly exploded, slapping the keys out of Julian's hand. They clattered onto the concrete. "Turn around. Put your hands on the hood of the car. Now!" Officer Boone finally stepped forward, looking panicked. "Brooks, maybe we should just run his name in the system." "Shut up, Boone!" Teller roared. He lunged forward, grabbing Julian violently by the shoulder of his hoodie and attempting to spin him around. Julian let himself be moved, offering no physical resistance. He knew the law. He knew the protocol. He knew that the moment he resisted, he gave Teller the legal cover he desperately wanted. But as Julian's chest hit the cold metal of the cruiser's hood, a profound, icy anger began to settle in his stomach. This wasn't just a bad cop. This was a predator in uniform. And Julian Voss was about to destroy his entire world. "Spread your legs," Teller commanded, kicking the inside of Julian's ankles roughly. Julian complied, his hands flat on the hood of the cruiser. "Officer Teller," Julian said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I want to be very clear. You are currently initiating an unlawful detainment. You have escalated a consensual encounter into a physical seizure without probable cause. You are violating Departmental Policy Section 4B regarding de-escalation, and you are violating my Fourth Amendment rights. Shut your mouth, Teller growled, patting Julian down with unnecessary aggression, his hands digging into the pockets of the sweatpants. He found a phone and pulled it out, tossing it onto the hood. You're a real smart guy, huh? You memorized the handbook to impress your criminal buddies. I know the handbook, Julian said quietly, turning his head slightly to make eye contact with the rookie, Boone, who was watching with wide, terrified eyes. Officer Boone, is it? You have a duty to intervene under the newly revised use of force policy. Your partner is currently breaking the law. If you do not stop him, you are legally complicit. Boone swallowed hard, taking a half-step forward. Brooks, he doesn't have any weapons on him. Maybe we should just— I said stay out of this, rookie. Teller unclipped the handcuffs from his duty belt. The metallic shink-shink sound cut through the quiet morning air. This arrogant thug thinks he can talk down to me? Thinks he can come into a decent neighborhood and quote the law to a sworn officer? Teller grabbed Julian's right wrist, wrenching it behind his back with enough force to strain the rotator cuff. Julian gritted his teeth but remained silent. The cold steel locked around his right wrist, tightening viciously. Teller grabbed the left wrist, snapping the second cuff into place. He intentionally squeezed the ratchets down an extra notch, ensuring the metal dug painfully into Julian's skin. There, Teller breathed heavily, leaning in close to Julian's ear. Not so tough now, are you, counselor? You're under arrest for trespassing, resisting an officer, and failure to identify. I have not resisted in any capacity, Julian stated calmly, staring at his own reflection in the cruiser's windshield. And you still haven't asked for my name. You asked for my physical ID. You never simply asked me who I was. Teller paused, realizing the technical error, but his ego immediately doubled down. I don't care what your name is, dirtbag. You're a John Doe in the system until you get fingerprinted. We're going to the precinct. Let's see how much case law you quote when you're sitting in a holding cell. Teller yanked Julian back by the chain of the handcuffs, nearly pulling the older man off his feet. Julian maintained his balance, his face an impenetrable mask of stoic resolve. As Teller shoved him toward the back seat of the cruiser, Julian stopped, planting his feet firmly. Officer Teller, Julian said, looking the angry cop dead in the eye. I am going to give you one final opportunity to remove these cuffs, apologize, and drive away. If you put me in the back of this vehicle, the trajectory of your life is going to change permanently. This is your final warning. For a split second, Teller hesitated. There was something deeply unsettling about the way this man spoke. There was no panic, no begging, no street bravado. It was the calm, terrifying certainty of a man holding a royal flush. But Teller had spent 15 years operating with total impunity. He had never faced consequences, and he wasn't about to start backing down to a suspect on his beat. Get in the damn car, Teller snarled, putting his hand on the top of Julian's head and shoving him roughly into the cramped, hard plastic back seat of the cruiser. He slammed the door shut with a heavy thud. Inside the car, Julian adjusted his wrists, wincing slightly as the tight metal bit into his flesh. He looked out the window at his home, the beautiful house he had bought just weeks ago, intending it to be a peaceful sanctuary. He watched as Teller scooped up the fallen keys from the sidewalk, casually tossing them into the bushes with a malicious smirk before climbing into the driver's seat. All right, Tyler, Teller said, putting the car in drive. Let's take out the trash. The ride to the 42nd precinct stretched on in dead silence. Teller occasionally glanced in the rearview mirror, trying to gauge his prisoner. But Julian just sat there, staring blankly ahead. He was no longer angry. The anger had crystallized into something cold, calculating, and absolute. He was silently drafting termination paperwork in his head. He was evaluating the systemic failures that allowed a man like Teller to wear a badge for a decade and a half. Boone, on the other hand, looked physically ill. The rookie kept checking his phone, fidgeting with his vest, sneaking nervous glances at the stoic man in the back. Boone had a sinking feeling in his gut. The man didn't look like a burglar. He looked like somebody important. "Hey," Boone whispered to Teller. "Did you look at his phone?" "Nah," Teller muttered. "Don't need to. Typical arrogant perp. Probably got a warrant out of county. We'll book him as a John Doe. Let him rot in holding for 48 hours, until he begs to tell us who he is." As the cruiser pulled into the fortified garage of the 42nd Precinct, the reality of the situation began to solidify. The precinct was a bustling hub of morning activity. Shift changes were happening. Detectives were walking to their cars with coffee cups. Uniformed officers were milling around the booking entrance. Teller parked the car and killed the engine. He stepped out, walked around to the rear, and opened the door, grabbing Julian by the arm and dragging him out. "Welcome to the real world, pal," Teller mocked, pushing Julian toward the heavy steel doors of the booking area. "Let's get you processed." Julian walked with a straight back and his head held high. As they entered the buzzing, fluorescent-lit precinct, the sheer gravity of what was about to happen hung in the air like a storm cloud. Julian Voss, the most powerful man in the city's law enforcement hierarchy, was being marched in handcuffs into his own department. The reckoning was not just coming, it had arrived. The booking area of the 42nd Precinct was loud, chaotic, and smelled faintly of bleach and stale sweat. Officers were shouting over each other. Phones were ringing incessantly, and a few unruly suspects were cursing loudly in the holding cells along the back wall. At the elevated front desk sat Sergeant Declan Byrne, a 25-year veteran who knew every face, every rumor, and every political shift in the department. Byrne was currently typing up an incident report, sipping from a massive styrofoam cup of black coffee. Teller swaggered through the double doors, practically parading Julian by the arm. He wanted everyone to see him. He wanted the validation of his peers. "Morning, Declan," Teller shouted over the din, flashing a cocky grin. "Got a fresh one for the cage. Caught this guy prowling around the Montgomery estate in Oak Ridge. Refused to ID, caught a serious attitude. We're going to book him as a John Doe and let him cool his heels." A few officers in the room chuckled, nodding at Teller. But as Teller marched Julian toward the booking desk, stepping fully into the harsh fluorescent light, the atmosphere in the room began to undergo a bizarre, rapid transformation. It didn't happen all at once. It started with Detective Lena Soto, who was standing by the fingerprint scanner. She looked up, her eyes landing on the man in handcuffs. Her jaw physically dropped, her coffee cup pausing midway to her mouth. She backed away slowly, as if she had just seen a ghost. Then, a patrol lieutenant walking past with a stack of files stopped dead in his tracks. The folders slipped from his grip, scattering across the linoleum floor, but he didn't even bend down to pick them up. He just stared, his face draining of all color. One by one, the conversations in the room died. The shouting ceased. The laughter evaporated. Within moments, the chaotic booking room had gone dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning unit and the squeak of Teller's boots on the floor. Teller frowned, looking around. He didn't understand the silence. "What's the matter with you people?" he scoffed. "Never seen a perp before." He shoved Julian up to the desk. "Hey, Byrne, let's get him processed." Sergeant Byrne didn't respond immediately. The older sergeant slowly lowered his coffee cup. He leaned forward over the elevated desk, his eyes wide behind his reading glasses, staring directly at Julian Voss. Byrne had been at the mayoral press conference recently. He had seen the internal memos. He knew exactly what the new commissioner looked like. Byrne's hands began to tremble. He looked from Julian to the handcuffs, and finally to Teller. "Brooks," Byrne croaked, his voice cracking violently. What have you done?" "I told you I caught him prowling," Teller said, rolling his eyes, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic reality crashing down around him. "Guy thinks he's a lawyer, kept quoting Terry v. Ohio at me. Let's get him in a cell." "Take the cuffs off him," Byrne whispered, standing up so fast his chair rolled backward and slammed into the wall. "Take the cuffs off him right now, Teller." Teller recoiled, confused and suddenly defensive. "What? No, he's a suspect, Declan. He resisted." Before Teller could finish his sentence, the heavy wooden door to the captain's office swung open. Captain Wesley Thorne, the commanding officer of the 42nd Precinct, stepped out holding a mug. Thorne was a tough, no-nonsense commander, but as his eyes swept over the booking room and landed on the desk, he froze so completely he looked like a statue. Thorne's eyes locked onto Julian. He saw the gray hoodie. He saw the sweatpants. He saw the steel handcuffs cutting into the man's wrists. The captain dropped his mug. It shattered on the floor, hot coffee splashing across the tiles, sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. Thorne didn't walk. He practically sprinted across the room, shoving Teller out of the way with enough force to send the heavy patrolman stumbling into a desk. "Commissioner Voss," Captain Thorne gasped, his voice tight with sheer, unadulterated panic. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely reach for his own cuff keys. "Sir, my God, sir, I'm so sorry, The word hung in the air like a detonation. "Commissioner?" Teller stopped breathing. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His stomach dropped so fast he felt dizzy. He looked at the man he had just assaulted, harassed, and illegally arrested. The man he had called a thug. "See, Commissioner?" Teller stammered, his voice weak, high-pitched, and trembling. He looked around wildly, hoping it was a sick joke, but the terrified faces of his colleagues confirmed his worst nightmare. Rookie Officer Boone, standing by the door, looked like he was about to pass out, leaning against the wall for physical support. Captain Thorne fumbled with his keys, practically tearing the handcuffs off Julian's wrists. "Sir, please, are you injured? Do you need a medic?" Julian slowly brought his hands forward. He didn't rub his wrists. He didn't yell. He didn't show an ounce of pain. He simply stood there, radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. The relaxed, stoic man from the driveway was gone. In his place stood the architect of the department's impending destruction. Julian slowly turned his head to look at Officer Teller. Teller was trembling now, his previous arrogance entirely shattered, replaced by the primal terror of a man watching his life's work evaporate in real time. "Captain Thorne," Julian said. His voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the precinct, it echoed like thunder. "Yes, sir," Thorne replied instantly, standing at rigid attention, sweat pouring down his forehead. "Officer Brooks Teller," Julian said, his eyes never leaving the trembling cop. "Badge number 4492. Strip him of his weapon. Strip him of his badge. He is suspended immediately without pay, pending an internal affairs investigation for false arrest, assault under color of law, civil rights violations, and kidnapping." Teller's knees buckled. "Kidnapping? Sir, Commissioner, please. It was a misunderstanding. I didn't know. You didn't know who I was." Julian cut him off, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper that chilled everyone in the room. "That is your defense? You thought you were just brutalizing an everyday citizen. You thought you were just violating the rights of someone who didn't have the power to fight back." Julian stepped forward, closing the distance until he was inches from Teller's face, mirroring the exact aggressive posture Teller had used on the street. "You are the exact cancer I was hired to cut out of this department, Teller," Julian said coldly. "And I am going to make an absolute, undeniable example out of you." He turned his gaze to the terrified rookie by the door. "Officer Boone." Boone jumped, standing at attention, tears welling in his eyes. "Yes? Yes, sir?" "You had a duty to intervene," Julian said sharply. "You failed. Surrender your badge and weapon to the sergeant. You are suspended pending review." Boone didn't argue. He numbly reached for his belt, his career ending before it had even begun. Julian turned back to Captain Thorne, who was still standing rigidly. "Captain, my keys are in the bushes outside my home. Send a unit to retrieve them. Then I want the complete personnel files of every officer on this shift on my desk by noon. We are going to find out exactly how deep this rot goes." "Yes, Commissioner," Thorne said, his voice trembling. As Julian Voss walked out of the precinct, the heavy steel doors slamming shut behind him, the silence remained. Teller stood frozen, staring at his empty hands, realizing that in a span of 30 minutes, his arrogance hadn't just cost him his badge, it had cost him his freedom. The karma was swift, ruthless, and absolutely permanent. The next morning, the headquarters of the Metropolitan Police Department was an absolute powder keg. The news of Commissioner Julian Voss's arrest and the subsequent suspension of Officer Brooks Teller had spread through the ranks like a raging wildfire. For the good officers, it was a long-awaited breath of fresh air. For the corrupt elements accustomed to the old ways, it was an unprecedented declaration of war. Voss sat behind his massive mahogany desk on the top floor of the headquarters. He was back in his tailored charcoal suit, reviewing the towering stacks of internal affairs files that Captain Elias Moreno, the newly appointed head of IA, had delivered. Moreno, a meticulous and unbribable 20-year veteran, stood quietly by the window, watching the commissioner work. "It's worse than we thought, Julian," Moreno said, breaking the silence. "Teller has a pattern. He specifically targeted minority men in affluent neighborhoods. We found 6 suppressed complaints in the last 3 years alone. Excessive force, unlawful detainment, and 2 allegations of planted evidence. The previous administration just swept them into a classified disciplinary tier." Voss didn't look up from the file. "I want them all reopened. Contact every single complainant. Offer them the full cooperation of my office for civil litigation." Before Moreno could reply, the heavy office doors were thrown open without a knock. In strode Ronan Fitzpatrick, the notoriously aggressive president of the Police Benevolent Association. Fitzpatrick was a hulking, red-faced man who treated the police department as his personal fiefdom. He had bullied the last 3 commissioners into submission using threats of strikes, media smear campaigns, and the political weight of his union. He marched up to Voss's desk, flanked by Sterling Vaughn, a high-priced union defense attorney known for getting bad cops back on the streets with full back pay. "Commissioner," Fitzpatrick barked, slamming a hand flat on the desk. "We need to have a talk right now. You are out of line, and you are creating a hostile work environment for my officers." Voss calmly closed the file he was reading, folded his hands on the desk, and looked up. "Good morning, Ronan. Mr. Vaughn, to what do I owe this intrusion?" "Cut the bureaucratic nonsense," Fitzpatrick growled. "You suspended Brooks Teller and a rookie without due process. You baited them, Voss. You went out of your way to look suspicious in a high-crime adjacent area just to set a trap. It's entrapment. It's a PR stunt, and the union is not going to stand for it. We want Teller reinstated by noon with a public apology, or I swear to God, you will see a blue flu strike so massive this city will burn by midnight." Vaughn, the lawyer, stepped forward with a smug smile. My client was acting within the scope of his duties, Commissioner. Terry stops are a recognized law enforcement tool. You refused to identify yourself. The force used was standard compliance protocol. If this goes to a disciplinary board, we will win. If you push for criminal charges, we will embarrass you in front of a grand jury. Voss let the silence stretch. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch at the threat of a strike. He simply reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a slim black folder. Mr. Vaughn, Voss began, his voice dangerously smooth. You are an intelligent lawyer, so I will assume you haven't yet seen the evidence, because if you had, you wouldn't be standing in my office tying your reputation to a sinking ship. Voss opened the folder and slid 3 high-resolution photographs across the desk. Fitzpatrick and Vaughn leaned in. Before my run, I authorized a departmental-wide upgrade to the cruiser dashcam and bodycam networks, Voss explained, watching the color slowly drain from Fitzpatrick's face. The old administration allowed officers to manually turn off their microphones during encounters. A convenient loophole, wouldn't you agree? I closed it. The system now syncs directly to a secure third-party cloud server managed by the FBI. Vaughn frowned, inspecting the photos. What does this prove? It proves, Voss said, leaning forward, that we have crisp, high-definition audio and video of Officer Teller outright stating his intention to manufacture a charge. We have audio of him mocking the law. We have video of him applying punitive physical force to a compliant citizen who had committed no crime. He bypassed departmental policy, state law, and federal constitutional rights in the span of 4 minutes. Fitzpatrick crossed his arms, trying to maintain his bluff. So what? A jury will see a cop making a tough call. It's a misdemeanor civil rights violation at best. He'll get probation, and we'll sue the city for wrongful termination. You misunderstand the scale of what is happening, Ronan, Voss said softly. He pressed a button on his intercom. Send him in. The side door to the commissioner's office opened, and a tall, sharp-suited man with a briefcase walked in. Fitzpatrick recognized him instantly, and a jolt of genuine fear shot through his spine. It was Nathaniel Crowe, the Assistant United States Attorney for the Civil Rights Division, one of the most ruthless federal prosecutors in the country. Gentlemen, Crowe said simply, taking a seat next to Moreno. Voss turned his attention back to the union boss. I didn't arrest Teller on state charges, Ronan. I bypassed the local DA entirely. Earlier that morning, a federal grand jury indicted Brooks Teller on federal charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, aggravated assault, and kidnapping. Because he moved me against my will and confined me without legal justification, it constitutes federal kidnapping. Vaughn's jaw went slack. The smugness vanished instantly. Federal charges meant a conviction rate of over 95%. It meant federal prison. But that's not why Mr. Crowe is here, Voss continued, his eyes locking onto Fitzpatrick with surgical precision. Mr. Crowe is here because the Department of Justice has been investigating the pattern of abuse in this precinct for 2 years. Teller isn't an isolated case. And if the police union attempts to orchestrate a blue flu strike to protect a federally indicted criminal, the DOJ will immediately file RICO charges against you, Ronan, for operating a criminal conspiracy to obstruct federal justice. The room went dead silent. The absolute uncompromising checkmate hung in the air. You have 2 choices, Fitzpatrick, Voss whispered, delivering the final blow. You can walk out of that door, publicly disavow Brooks Teller, and let the justice system do its job. Or you can stand by him, and I will let Crowe freeze the union's pension funds by this afternoon under federal asset forfeiture laws. Fitzpatrick stared at Voss. The union boss was a bully, But he wasn't a fool. He knew when he had been completely, utterly beaten. The political capital, the legal defenses, the threats, all of it, had been rendered entirely useless by a man who was 10 steps ahead. Without a single word, Fitzpatrick turned on his heel and walked out of the office. Vaughn looked at the files, looked at the federal prosecutor, and hurriedly followed his union boss, abandoning his client. Brooks Teller was now entirely alone. The shield he had hidden behind for 15 years had just been shattered to pieces. Months later, the atmosphere inside courtroom 3B of the United States District Court was suffocatingly tense. Judge Percival Hale, a stern, no-nonsense federal judge with a reputation for merciless sentencing, peered over his reading glasses at the defense table. Sitting there was Brooks Teller. The transformation of the man was jarring. The arrogant, chest-puffing patrolman who had strutted through the 42nd precinct was gone. In his place was a diminished, pale, and terrified man wearing an ill-fitting gray suit. He had lost weight. He jumped at sudden noises. The reality of facing up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary had completely broken his spirit. Because the union had abandoned him, Teller was represented by a desperate public defender who was entirely outmatched by the federal prosecution team. The gallery was packed with reporters, civil rights advocates, and dozens of police officers, good cops who had come to watch the cleansing of their department. Assistant U.S. Attorney Nathaniel Crowe stood at the podium, wrapping up his closing arguments. The trial had been a bloodbath for the defense. The dashcam footage had been played, stripping away any illusion of proactive policing. But the most devastating blow had come just days prior. Rookie officer Tyler Boone, terrified of going to federal prison, had accepted a plea deal. In exchange for immunity, Boone took the stand and testified for 3 grueling hours. He detailed Teller's absolute disregard for the law. He confessed that Teller had explicitly told him to find a reason to arrest people who didn't fit his demographic preferences. Boone's testimony destroyed Teller's only defense, the claim of a simple misunderstanding. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Crowe projected, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom. The defendant, Brooks Teller, wore a badge that represents the sacred trust between the state and the people. I took that trust, weaponized it, and used it to terrorize individuals he deemed beneath him. He operated under the assumption that he was the law. But on that morning in Oak Ridge Heights, he arrested the wrong man. He arrested a man who knew his rights, a man who possessed the courage and the authority to finally hold a predator accountable. Crowe pointed a finger directly at Teller, who flinched, shrinking down in his chair. "This is not a case of a split-second mistake," Crowe continued. "This is a case of malice, of arrogance, and of criminal entitlement. We ask that you find the defendant guilty on all counts." The jury deliberated briefly. When they returned, the foreman stood, clutching the verdict sheet. Teller stood up, his knees visibly shaking, his hands gripping the edge of the defense table so hard his knuckles turned white. "On the count of deprivation of rights under color of law," the foreman read clearly, "we find the defendant guilty. On the count of aggravated assault, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of federal kidnapping, we find the defendant guilty." A collective gasp swept through the gallery, followed by a hushed, relieved murmur. Teller collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands, silently sobbing as his entire life evaporated. Judge Hale banged his gavel, demanding silence. He looked down at Teller with absolute disgust. "Mr. Teller, stand up," Judge Hale ordered. Teller struggled to his feet, crying openly now. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a more blatant abuse of power." Hale boomed, his voice dripping with contempt. You disgraced your uniform. You betrayed the public trust. Men like you are the reason communities live in fear of the very people sworn to protect them. You relied on the power of the state to shield you from the consequences of your cruelty. The judge leaned forward, his eyes burning into the convicted cop. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 144 months, 12 years, in a federal correctional facility. Furthermore, due to the felony nature of your convictions, your state pension is permanently revoked. You will never serve in law enforcement again. Officers, take him into custody. 2 U.S. Marshals immediately flanked Teller. They grabbed his arms, pulling them behind his back. The sharp, metallic shink, shink of the handcuffs echoed in the courtroom. It was the exact sound Teller had so arrogantly subjected Julian Voss to months prior. Karma had come full circle as Teller was marched down the aisle, weeping and utterly broken. He locked eyes with a man sitting quietly in the back row of the gallery. Commissioner Julian Voss sat perfectly still, his expression neutral, his hands folded in his lap. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply watched the cancer being surgically removed from his department. The eye contact lasted only a second, but it was enough. Teller looked away, a hollow shell of a man shuffling out of the courtroom and out of society. Later that evening, the sun was setting over the quiet, affluent neighborhood of Oak Ridge Heights. The sky was painted in strokes of brilliant orange and deep purple. Julian Voss, dressed in a faded gray college hoodie and black sweatpants, jogged slowly down his winding cobblestone driveway. The neighborhood was peaceful. No cruisers idled aggressively by the curb. No flashing lights interrupted the serenity. He reached the end of the driveway, breathing in the crisp evening air. He pulled a ring of keys from his pocket and stepped up to the massive wrought iron mailbox. With a swift, practiced motion, he tightened the loose hinge he had been working on months ago, testing the metal door. It closed perfectly with a satisfying click. Julian smiled faintly, turned around, and walked back up to his $6 million estate. The streets were safe. His department was clean. The true work had finally begun. If you loved hearing how sweet, undeniable justice was served to someone who thought they were above the law, you won't want to miss our next story. Karma has a way of catching up to those who abuse their power, and we bring you the most intense, satisfying, real-life reckonings every single week. Make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with anyone who loves a brilliant twist, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible daily storytelling.